The Shadow of Man, Chapter 9. Flo and her family. Old Flo lay on her back in the early morning sunshine, her belly full of palm nuts, and suspended Flint above her, grasping one of his minute wrists with her large horny foot. As he dangled, gently waving his free arm and kicking with his legs, she reached up and tickled him in his groin and his neck, until he opened his mouth in the play face or chimpanzee smile. Close by, Fifi sat, staring at Flint, occasionally reaching out to touch her 10-week-old brother very gently with one hand. Figgin and Fabian, Flo's two elder sons, played with each other nearby. Since Flint's birth, 2.5 months earlier, Fabian had begun to move around with his family more and more frequently. Every so often, as their game became extra vigorous, I could hear the panting chuckles of chimpanzee laughter. It's like that. Suddenly, Fabian, 3 or 4 years Figgin senior, began to play rather roughly, sitting down and kicking with the soles of his feet on Figgin's bent head. After a few moments, Figgin had had enough. He left Fabian and with his jaunty walk approached Fifi and tried to play with her. But at that moment, Flo, gathering Flint to her breast, got up to move into the shade, and Fifi pulled away from Figgin to follow her mother. For since Hugo and I had returned to the Gombe stream when Flint was 7 weeks old, Fifi had become increasingly fascinated by her new brother. Flo sat down and began to tickle Flint's neck with small, nibbling movements of her worn old teeth, and Fifi once again sat close by and reached out to make a few grooming movements on Flint's back. Flo ignored this. Earlier, though, when Flint was under 2 months, Flo had usually pushed Fifi's hand away each time she tried to touch Flint, and often the only way in which the child had been able to contact the infant had been by solicitously grooming Flo, working ever closer and closer to those places where Flint's hands gripped his mother's hair. Intently, Fifi had groomed around the hands, occasionally briefly fondling the minute fingers, and then, with a glance at Flo, hastily returning to groom her mother. Now, however, Flint was older, and for the most part, Fifi was permitted to touch him. As I watched, Fifi began to play with Flint, taking one hand and nibbling the fingers. Flint gave a soft whimper. Perhaps Fifi had hurt him, and instantly Flo pushed her daughter's hand away and cuddled her infant closely. Frustrated, Fifi rocked slightly to and fro, twisting her arms behind her head and staring at Flint, her lips slightly pouted. It was not long before she reached out, more gently, to touch him again. I have always thought that human children become increasingly fascinating as they grow out of the helpless baby stage and begin to respond to people and things. Certainly, a chimpanzee baby becomes more attractive as it grows older, not only to its mother and siblings, but to the other members of the community, and to mere human observers. For Hugo and I, the privilege of being able to watch Flint's progress that year remains one of the most delightful of our experiences, comparable only with the joy we were to know much later as we watched our own son growing up. When Flint was 3 months old, he was able to pull himself about on Flo's body, taking handfuls of her hair, pulling with his arms and pushing with his feet. And at this time, he began to respond when Fifi approached by reaching out towards her. Fifi became more and more preoccupied with him. She began to make repeated attempts to pull him away from his mother. At first, Flo firmly prevented this, but even when Fifi persisted, pulling at her brother again and again, Flo never punished her. Sometimes she pushed the child's hand away, sometimes she simply walked away, leaving Fifi rocking slightly, her limbs contorted. And sometimes when Fifi was extra troublesome, Flo, instead of repulsing her advances, either groomed her or played with her quite vigorously. These activities usually serve to distract Fifi's attention, at least temporarily, from her infant brother. As the year wore on, it seemed that Flo, perhaps as a result of playing so often with Flint and Fifi, her two younger children, became more and more playful herself. Often as the weeks passed, we saw her playing with both Figgin and 12-year-old Fabian, tickling them or chasing them round and round a tree trunk, with Flint hanging on for dear life. On one occasion, in the middle of a romp with Fabian, this old female lowered her balding head to the ground, raised her bony rump in the air, and actually turned a somersault. And then, almost as though she felt slightly ridiculous, she moved away, sat down, and began to groom Flint very intently. When Flint was 13 weeks old, we saw Fifi succeed in pulling him away from his mother. Flo was grooming Figgin when Fifi, with infinite caution and many quick glances towards her mother's face, began to pull at Flint's foot. Inch by inch, she drew the infant towards her, and all at once he was in her arms. Fifi lay on her back and cuddled Flint to her tummy with her arms and legs. She lay very still. To our surprise, Flo, for the first few moments, appeared to take no notice at all. But when Flint, who'd possibly never before lost contact with his mother's body, reached round and held his arms towards her, pouting his lips and uttering a soft "ooh" of distress, Flo instantly gathered him to her breast and bent to kiss his head with her lips. Flint eagerly sought the reassurance of his mother's breast, suckling for a few moments before turning to look at Fifi again. And Fifi, her hands clasped behind her head, her elbows in the air, stared and stared at Flint. 10 minutes later, Fifi was again permitted to hold Flint for a short while, but once more, the moment Flint gave his tiny, distressed whimper, Flo rescued him. And Flint, as before, suckled briefly when he regained the security of his mother's arms. After this, not a day passed but that Fifi pulled her infant brother away from Flo. As time passed, Flint became accustomed to the arms of his sibling, and so she was able to hold him for longer and longer before he uttered the tiny sound that, for the next 9 months, would bring Flo hastening to his rescue. Flo even permitted Fifi to carry Flint when the family wandered off through the forest. On those occasions when Flo and her family were part of some big group, however, Flo was more possessive of her infant. Then, if Fifi moved away with Flint, Flo followed, uttering soft whimpers herself, until she caught up with the kidnapper and retrieved her infant. Even then, however, Fifi was not punished. Flo simply reached forward, grabbed hold of her daughter's ankle, and then gathered Flint into her arms. Sometimes Fifi led her old mother a merry dance, round and round trees, under low vegetation, where Flo had to creep almost on her belly, even up into the trees. And sometimes, too, as though to prevent Flo from catching hold of her, she walked backwards in front of her mother, grunting softly and bobbing up and down, as though in submission, but not, until she was forced to, relinquishing Flint. When Flint was very small, his 2 elder brothers, although they sometimes stared at him, paid him little attention. Occasionally Fabian, whilst he was grooming with his mother, very gently patted the infant, but Figgin, though he was such an integral part of the family, seemed afraid to touch Flint in the early days. If, when Figgin and Flo were grooming, the infant accidentally touched Figgin, as baby fashion he waved his arms about, Figgin, after a quick glance at Flo's face, seemed to avoid looking at Flint. For Figgin, though he was a vigorous adolescent male, still showed great respect for his mother. One occasion is vivid in my memory. Fifi had taken Flint and was sitting grooming the infant some 10 yards from Flo. Presently Figgin approached and sat beside his sister. Flint turned towards him, and with his wide-eyed gaze fixed on Figgin's face, reached out to grasp his brother's chest hair. Figgin started, and after a quick glance in Flo's direction, raised his hands up and away from the baby. Then he stayed motionless, staring down at Flint, his lips tense. The infant pulled closer and nuzzled at Figgins' breast, then all at once seemed afraid of the unfamiliar. Usually, of course, his only contacts were Flo and Fifi, and if he reached towards either of them, they always responded by holding him close. With a slight pout, Flint turned back to Fifi, but then, as though confused, he again reached to Figgin with a soft whimper. At this, Flo came hurrying to his rescue, and as she approached, Figgin too gave low, worried cries and raised his hands even higher, as in the age-old gesture of surrender. Flo gathered up her infant, and Figgin lowered his hands slowly, as if dazed. One day, when Flint was just under 5 months old, Flo got up to go, and instead of pressing Flint to her belly, took his arm in one hand and hoisted him over her shoulder onto her back. There he remained for a few yards before he slipped down and clung to her arm. For a short distance, Flo continued, with Flint gripping around her elbow, and then she pushed him back under her tummy. But the next day, when Flo arrived in camp, Flint was clinging precariously to her back, hanging onto her sparse hair with his hands and feet. When Flo left, she again pushed her son up onto her back, and again he clung there for a while before sliding down and dangling from one hand by her side. This time, after walking 30 yards or so, Flo pushed him once more onto her back. After this, Flint nearly always rode on Flo's back, or else dangled beside her whilst she walked the mountains. This was not surprising, for all infants after a certain age start riding their mothers rather than clinging on beneath. But we were astonished to see that Fifi, when next we saw her take Flint, also tried to push him onto her back. This was surely an example of learning by direct observation of her mother's behaviour. By the time Flint was 5 months old, he'd become an accomplished rider and only occasionally slipped down to dangle beside Flo as she walked. But if there was any sign of excitement amongst the group, or if Flo was about to move into thick undergrowth, then she always reached back and pushed Flint round so that he clung as before underneath. After a while, he learned to wriggle round under Flo of his own accord in response to the slightest touch. It was about the same time as Flint began to ride on Flo's back that we first saw him take a step by himself. For some weeks previously, he'd been able to stand on the ground, balanced on 3 limbs and clinging to Flo's hair with one hand, and occasionally he'd taken a couple of steps in this manner. On this particular morning, he suddenly let go of Flo and stood by himself, all 4 limbs on the ground. Then, very deliberately, he lifted one hand off the ground, moved it forward safely, and paused. He lifted a foot off the ground, lurched sideways, staggered, and fell on his nose with a whimper. Instantly, Flo reached out and scooped him into her arms. But that was the beginning. After that, each day, Flint walked 1 or 2 steps further, but for months he was incredibly wobbly. Constantly, he got his hands and feet muddled up and fell, and always Flo was quick to gather him up. Often, indeed, she kept one hand under his tummy as he tottered along. Just after he began to walk, Flint began to try to climb. One day we saw him standing upright, holding on to a tiny sapling with both hands and gripping it first with one foot and then the other. But he never managed to get both feet off the ground at once, and each time, after a few moments, he fell backwards onto the ground. Subsequently, he repeated this performance several times, and Flo, as she groomed Fifi, idly held one hand behind his back, preventing further tumbles. A week after his first attempt, Flint was able to climb a short way quite easily. Like a human child, he found it much harder to get down by himself, but Flo, of course, was very watchful, as indeed was Fifi, and one or other of his guardians reached to rescue him the moment he gave his soft whimper. Flo, in fact, often retrieved him when she noticed that the end of the branch on which he was swinging was beginning to bend. and when Flint himself was perfectly contented. She was equally quick to seize him if she saw any sign of social excitement or aggression amongst other members of the group. Gradually, Flint learned to control his limbs slightly better when walking, although he still often relied on speed rather than coordination to get him from one place to another. He began to venture several yards away from Flo, and since any movement away from his mother was intensely exciting, and any excitement set his hair on end, he tottered around like a fluffy black ball, his wide-eyed gaze fixed intently on some object or individual in front of him. It was at this time that Fifi's fascination for her small brother became almost an obsession. She spent nearly all her day playing with him, grooming him as he slept, or carrying him about with her. Flo, it seemed, was often far from displeased to shed, from time to time, part of her load of maternal responsibility. Provided that Fifi didn't carry Flint out of sight, and provided there were no potentially aggressive males nearby, she no longer objected when Fifi kidnapped Flint, nor did Flo seem to mind if other youngsters approached Flint to play gently with him. But Fifi did. If she suddenly noticed Gilka or another of her erstwhile playmates close to Flint, Fifi instantly abandoned whatever she was doing, rushed over and chased the youngster away, her hair bristling, her arms flailing, her feet stamping the ground. Even chimps much older than herself, provided they were subordinate to Flo, were threatened or even attacked by aggressive Fifi. Presumably she acted on the assumption that if anything went wrong, old Flo would hurry to her assistance, and it seemed that the victims of her fury were fully aware of that too. Fifi, however, could not chase Figgin or Fabin away from Flint, and as the infant grew up, both of his older brothers showed more and more interest in him. Often they would approach and play with him, tickling him or pushing him gently to and fro as he dangled, legs kicking from a low branch. Sometimes when Figgin was playing with Flint, we saw Fifi hurry up and try to initiate a game with Figgin. Often she was successful, and then when the game was over, Fifi hurried back to play with Flint herself. Was she perhaps practicing the same technique of distraction that Flo had used so often on her? When Flint tottered up to one of the adult males, Fifi, of course, could scarcely interfere. She merely sat and stared as David or Goliath or Mike reached out and time again patted Flint or gently embraced him. And as the weeks went by, Flint, like a spoilt human child, wanted more and more attention. One day, as he wobbled up to old Mr. McGregor, the male got up and moved away. It was not, I think, deliberate. It just happened that he was about to leave. Flint stopped dead, staring with widening eyes at the male's retreating rear, and then stumbling along with frantic haste, falling again and again on his face, Flint followed. All the time he offered his soft whimper. Within minutes, Flo was rushing to retrieve him. But that was only the start of it, and for the next few weeks, Flint was always whimpering along after one or other of the adult males who had not deigned to stop and greet him, or who had walked away from the infant for any reason whatsoever. Quite often the male concerned, uneasy perhaps at the little calls following in his wake, stopped or turned back to pat Flint. When Flint was 8 months old, he sometimes spent 15 minutes or so out of contact with Flo as he played or explored, but he was never very far away from her. He was a little steadier on his feet, and he was able to join Fifi in some of her slightly rougher games, chasing round and round a grass tuft, or pulling himself on top of her as she lay on the ground, and tickling her with his hands and mouth. It was at this time that the termiting season began. One day, when Flo was fishing for termites, it became obvious that Figgin and Fifi, who'd been eating termites at the same heap, were getting restless and wanted to go. But old Flo, who'd already fished for 2 hours and who was herself only getting about 2 termites every 5 minutes, showed no sign of stopping. Being an old female, it was possible she might continue for another hour at least. Several times Figan had set off resolutely along the track leading to the stream, but on each occasion, after repeatedly looking back at Flo, he'd given up and returned to wait for his mother. Flint, too young to mind where he was, pottered about on the heap, occasionally dabbing at a termite. Suddenly Figan got up again, and this time approached Flint. Adopting the posture of a mother who signals her infant to climb onto her back, Figan bent one leg and reached back his hand to Flint, offering a soft pleading whimper. Flint tottered up to him at once, and Figan, still whimpering, put his hand under Flint and gently pushed him onto his back. Once Flint was safely aboard, Figan, with another quick glance at Flo, set off rapidly along the track. A moment later, Flo discarded her tool and followed. Hugo and I were amazed at this further example of Figan's ingenuity in getting his own way. But had his behaviour really been deliberate? We couldn't, of course, be sure. And then, a few days later, Fifi did exactly the same thing. Subsequently, we watched Fabian take Flint to his breast after he, too, had tried several times to persuade his mother to follow him away from a termite heap. We had never seen Fabian carrying Flint before. As the termite season wore on, there could be no doubt that Flo's elder offspring were kidnapping Flint with the deliberate intention of getting their mother to stop, at least for a while, her endless termiting. We saw all three of them taking Flint in this way on any number of occasions. Of course, they weren't always successful. Often Flint dropped off and ran back to his mother of his own accord. And sometimes, if Flo's hole was still yielding a good supply of termites, she hurried to retrieve Flint and then returned to the heap, followed by the unsuccessful kidnapper, who usually tried again later. Flint, of course, was too young to show any interest in eating termites. He now and then sampled a mouthful of fig or banana, but still received virtually all his nourishment from his mother's milk, and would continue to do so for another year. He did occasionally poke at a crawling termite with his finger, and he played with discarded grass tools when he was wandering about on a termite heap. Also, he began to mop everything. When termites are spilled onto the surface of the heap, older chimps mop them up with the backs of their wrists, like this. The termites become entangled in the hairs and are picked off with the lips. It was soon after the termite season began that Flint started to mop things: the ground, his own legs, his mother's back as he rode along, anything but termites. In fact, though he sometimes gazed intently for a few moments as his mother or one of his siblings worked, he was not really interested in this activity, which so absorbed his elders. Fifi, on the other hand, was a keen termite fisher, and when Flint, wanting to play with his sister, jumped onto her and scattered the insects from her grass stem, she was quite obviously irritated. He pushed him away roughly time and time again. Of course, Fifi still played with Flint frequently herself when she was not termiting, but almost as though some spell had been broken, she never again showed quite the same fanatical preoccupation with him. She no longer protected him so constantly from social contact with other young chimps. And so Flint began to enlarge his circle of friends. But Fifi, particularly when she was working at a termite heap, often permitted Gilko or one of the other juveniles to approach and play with Flint, and she no longer rushed aggressively up every time one or other of the adolescent females carried Flint around or groomed him or played with him. Flint, in fact, was growing up. Even when Fifi did devote all her attention to her little brother, she could no longer treat him as her doll, for he had developed a mind of his own. If Fifi wanted to carry him in one direction, and he wanted to go somewhere else, then he struggled to get away from her and went his way. Also, of course, he was getting heavier. One day when Flint was sleeping in her lap and gripping tightly to her hair, it was obvious he was hurting his sister. Fifi carefully detached first one hand and then the other, but as soon as they were loosened, Flint, disturbed, gripped on again tightly. Finally, for the first time on record, Fifi carried the infant back to Flo and pushed him in her mother's direction. When Flint was 1 year old, he was still wobbly on his legs, but he was quick to bounce towards any game that was in progress, and eager to hurry over to greet any newcomer that joined his group. He was, in fact, beginning to take part in the social life of his community, a community which, at that time, was still unsettled as a result of the dramatic rise to overall dominance of Mike. Flint could scarcely have been aware of the battle of wills that had finally led to Goliath's defeat, for it had started at the time of his birth. Flint grew up in a world where Mike, undisputedly, was supreme.